The factory whistle had just blown when Mary Ellen Parker clocked out of her shift. The time was 11:42 p.m., Friday, June 21st, 1974. She folded her apron, placed it neatly in her locker, and walked out through the narrow hallway toward the dimly lit parking lot. The night was quiet except for the hum of crickets and the low rumble of distant trucks on Route 17. Mary Ellen started her green Plymouth Duster and waited a few seconds before turning on the headlights. The radio played faintly through the static. She drove away from the factory, her tires crunching over the gravel, leaving behind the sound of machinery and fluorescent buzz. It was an ordinary drive she had made 100 times before, 13 miles, through farmland and narrow curves before reaching her small rented house near Cedar Grove. Her sister Alice would later say that Mary Ellen always took the same road, no matter how late it was. She believed she knew it too well to ever feel afraid. At 11:57 p.m., a passing truck driver noticed the green Duster ahead of him, moving slower than usual. He remembered the taillights flickering near mile marker 9. After that, the car seemed to vanish into the dark. The driver thought nothing of it and continued toward the highway. When Mary Ellen failed to show up for her morning shift the next day, her supervisor, Mrs. Thompson, assumed she was sick. By afternoon, Alice called the factory. The two sisters spoke almost every day, and missing a Friday call was unlike her. That evening, Alice contacted the county sheriff's office. At 7:45 p.m., Deputy Carl Peterson began a standard missing person check. He drove out along Route 17, following the path Mary Ellen usually took home. The summer light was fading, and the road stretched empty across miles of open land. Less than a mile past the Miller Creek Bridge, Peterson saw something that made him slow down. A car was parked along the shoulder, angled slightly toward the ditch. The headlights were off, but the driver's door was open. He pulled over and stepped out carefully. The green Plymouth Duster sat silent in the fading dusk. The keys were still in the ignition. The engine was warm to the touch, though no one was inside. On the passenger seat lay a brown leather purse. A styrofoam coffee cup sat in the holder, half full, the liquid still faintly steaming. Peterson called for backup. Within 20 minutes, another patrol car arrived. They used flashlights to sweep the area. There were no signs of struggle inside the vehicle. No blood, no broken glass. Her work ID badge hung from the rearview mirror. Everything looked strangely untouched. About 20 yards from the car, faint footprints were found in the dirt, one set of women's shoe prints and another larger set leading toward the cornfield that bordered the road. The ground was soft from rain earlier that week, and impressions were clear but shallow. Detective Harold Whitmore, head of investigations for the county, arrived shortly after midnight. He was a man known for his patience and detail. He studied the scene in silence, scanning the surroundings as if the air itself might hold an answer. He ordered the vehicle to be towed and the area cordoned off until daylight. The next morning, the search began. Officers combed both sides of Route 17, walking in a slow line. Volunteers from town joined in, their flashlights moving through the tall corn like fireflies. Nothing was found except for a small fabric button lying near the tire tracks. It was pale blue, possibly from a blouse. By noon, helicopters circled above the fields. Dogs were brought in from neighboring counties, but the trail ended less than 50 feet from where the car had stopped. The scent disappeared entirely. Reporters began to appear near the roadside. Questions filled the air, but answers were scarce. The sheriff gave a brief statement. "A young woman is missing. We are treating this as suspicious." He refused further comment. That night, the car was processed in the department garage. Fingerprints were lifted from the steering wheel and door handle. All belonged to Mary Ellen. Forensics found nothing that pointed to a struggle. No foreign prints, no fibers, no signs of forced entry. The strangeness of the scene unsettled everyone. It was as if Mary Ellen had stepped out of her car and simply vanished. Her coffee was still warm, her purse untouched, her headlights switched off. It made no sense. Detective Whitmore stood by the car long after the others left, studying the open door. The rain began again, light and steady. He made one final note in his pad before closing it slowly. The entry read, "Vehicle abandoned. Engine warm. No signs of flight or pursuit. Unknown subject may have approached from the field." The next step would be to find where those footprints led, but by morning, the rain had washed them away. Mary Ellen Harper was 26 years old when she vanished. She lived in a one-bedroom house on the edge of Cedar Grove, a quiet stretch of rural Kentucky, where everyone seemed to know everyone. She worked long shifts at the Greenfield textile factory, 6 days a week, usually covering nights. Her co-workers described her as polite, dependable, and soft-spoken, the kind of person who never raised her voice and never came late. After her mother passed away 2 years earlier, Mary Ellen stayed in the same small house they had shared. She kept the curtains the way her mother liked them, and the family Bible on the kitchen table. Her father had died when she was a child, and her younger sister Alice lived 2 counties away with her husband. The sisters spoke often, sometimes through letters, sometimes on the phone late at night after Mary Ellen's shift. She had few close friends outside of work. Most of her evenings were spent reading or sewing. She had been saving money to attend night school in Lexington. Her goal was to become a medical assistant, a quiet dream she mentioned in her letters to Alice. Those letters were simple, filled with daily routines, weather updates, small frustrations, factory gossip and thoughts about the future. There was never a trace of fear or tension in her words. Mary Ellen's co-workers said she was steady. She rarely missed a day, and if she did, she always called ahead. She kept to herself but was never unfriendly. One worker remembered that she often brought homemade cornbread for the lunchroom, wrapped neatly in wax paper. Another recalled her humming old country songs while sorting fabric. Her life was ordinary in every sense. No debts, no enemies, no drama. She had dated a man briefly the previous year, a factory mechanic named Tom Hayes, but it ended quietly. He later told police that they simply wanted different things. There were no reports of arguments, no signs of trouble. Neighbors described her as gentle and cautious. She locked her doors, kept a porch light on at night, and usually drove straight home after work. Her car, the green Plymouth Duster, was her pride. She had saved 2 years to buy it used from a local dealer. In every account, Mary Ellen Harper was stable, responsible, and predictable. That stability made her disappearance feel impossible. Nothing in her life hinted at danger or escape. She was a young woman building a modest future, living within the same daily rhythm she had always known. By Sunday morning, her sister reported her missing. The green Plymouth Duster sat alone on the side of Route 17, its headlights off, the driver's door wide open. Deputy Carl Peterson had been the first to arrive. He stepped out of his patrol car, radio in hand, scanning the quiet stretch of road lit only by his flashlight beam. The engine of the Duster was still warm. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and rain-soaked earth. On the passenger seat sat a brown leather purse. Inside were identification cards, a small wallet with $28, and a neatly folded letter addressed to her sister. Alice, a styrofoam coffee cup rested in the holder, half full, the surface rippling slightly in the night air. Nothing looked disturbed. There were no scratches, no broken glass, and no signs of struggle. Detective Harold Whitmore arrived just before midnight. He stood beside the car for several minutes, saying nothing. He noted that the car keys were still in the ignition, the headlights off, and the driver's seat pushed forward slightly. It looked as if the driver had stepped out for a brief moment and never returned. The first task was to secure the area. Officers placed flares along the road and photographed the scene from every angle. The trunk was checked and empty. The glove box contained a registration paper, a pack of tissues, and a gas receipt time-stamped 10:51 p.m. from a nearby station. As word spread through the county, more officers joined the search. They swept the roadside ditches and fields using handheld lights. The nearest residents, about half a mile away, were awakened and questioned. One farmer said he saw a blue pickup truck parked on that stretch earlier that night, but he couldn't recall the time or license plate. Another woman mentioned hearing a car door slam around midnight, but nothing else. At 3:00 a.m., a forensic technician dusted the vehicle for prints. Every visible surface was checked: the steering wheel, gearshift, door handles, and rearview mirror. All the prints matched Mary Ellen Harper. No foreign fingerprints were recovered. The ground near the car showed tire marks leading toward the shoulder, but no indication of forced impact. The next morning, daylight revealed more of the scene. Investigators searched both sides of Route 17 on foot. They found the faint outline of 2 sets of footprints leading away from the vehicle, one small, consistent with a woman's shoe, and one larger, deeper, moving toward the nearby cornfield. The soil was damp, making impressions soft but readable. Detectives photographed and cast them before the rain clouds gathered again. By mid-morning, the sheriff's department organized a larger search. Volunteers from town joined, forming lines that stretched across the fields. The air buzzed with radios and anxious voices. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the terrain for any sign of movement or clothing. Nothing appeared. The fields gave nothing back. Inside the sheriff's office, the investigation room filled quickly with maps, photographs, and witness reports. Every possible route home was marked in red. The last confirmed sighting remained the truck driver, who had seen Mary Ellen's car near mile marker 9 shortly before midnight. As the first 24 hours passed, tension grew. The media had not yet picked up the story, but the small town already knew. Calls came in from people claiming to have seen a strange vehicle, a man walking by the highway, or headlights in the woods. Most were checked and dismissed. By Saturday evening, the search radius expanded to 5 miles. Officers used dogs to trace any remaining scent, but the trail ended abruptly near the cornfield. The rain had returned by nightfall, erasing what little evidence remained. Detective Whitmore reviewed the caseboard late that night. Every clue pointed back to the same place, the abandoned car. It was clean, quiet, and carefully left. There was no chaos, no theft, and no clear sign of why Mary Ellen had stopped. The following morning, as the sun rose over Route 17, a deputy walking behind the cornfield noticed something half buried in mud, faint but distinct. 2 footprints side by side leading deeper between the rows of corn. The prints were fresh enough to stir new urgency, but the path beyond them disappeared into darkness. The sirens had gone silent, but the search had only begun. Detective Harold Whitmore stood beside the abandoned car, scanning the empty road as the morning fog lifted. He had been called in less than 12 hours after Mary Ellen vanished. Calm, deliberate, and known for his patience, Whitmore began what would become one of the most exhaustive searches the county had ever seen. By sunrise, patrol cars lined the highway. Officers marked off the perimeter, while volunteers gathered at the community center. Helicopters from the state police circled overhead, their blades chopping through the early mist. The search expanded into nearby fields, creeks, and forest edges. Every bootprint was measured, every tire mark photographed. Yet as hours stretched into days, the trail grew colder. Whitmore ordered river divers into the narrow channels west of the highway. The current was slow, the water clear, but nothing. It surfaced. No clothing, no purse, no sign that Mary Ellen had ever entered it. Along the banks, officers combed through the mud, pulling out branches and debris, cataloging anything that might hold meaning. Rumors began to spread faster than official reports. Some whispered that an ex-boyfriend had been jealous, that he had followed her that night. Others claimed a stranger from Tennessee had been passing through, driving a blue pickup, similar to the one locals saw near the spot. The sheriff's office confirmed none of it, but speculation filled every diner and gas station in town. Detective Whitmore kept his focus on evidence. He revisited the car again and again, standing quietly beside the driver's seat, studying what others had missed. The purse was still there, untouched. The keys rested on the dash, and the half-finished cup of coffee had gone cold. There were no fingerprints other than hers. No fibers, no struggle, no trace of anyone else. By the 3rd day, search grids were established. Maps covered the walls of the temporary command post. Each section was marked off in red, where officers had already searched. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the cornfields, calling her name, listening for anything that might answer back. The pressure on the department grew. News crews arrived from nearby cities, filming the exhausted faces of deputies returning empty-handed. Families offered to help, and neighbors brought food to the search teams, but morale began to fade. Every night ended with the same update. No leads, no evidence, no Mary Ellen. Whitmore expanded the radius to include abandoned sheds and hunting cabins. Officers were sent to interview store clerks, gas station attendants, and anyone who had been on the highway that night. One man claimed he had seen a drifter near the truck stop, thin, unshaven, wearing a dark jacket, but the description matched half the travelers passing through that week. Forensics analyzed the car again, testing soil samples from the tires and comparing them to nearby terrain. Nothing unusual. The vehicle appeared to have stopped willingly, not forced. That single fact haunted Whitmore more than anything else. She had pulled over for a reason, but what reason? A week after her disappearance, the official search was scaled back. Helicopters stopped flying overhead. Volunteers returned home. Only a few officers continued the daily sweeps. Whitmore remained, unwilling to close the scene. He returned to the cornfields, walking the narrow dirt path behind the last search line. The air was still and the sun was beginning to set when two hunters approached from the east side of the woods. One of them held something small in his gloved hand, a torn piece of fabric, weathered and pale, caught on a low branch. It looked old, maybe nothing, but under the fading light Whitmore saw the faint pattern. It matched the floral print from the dress Mary Ellen had worn the night she vanished. The detective sealed it carefully inside an evidence bag. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that follows when hope and dread meet at the same point. Was it a clue, or just another dead end? The next chapter of the investigation would reveal which. The news spread faster than any official update. Within days, every street corner, diner, and church pew carried the same name, Mary Ellen. People spoke it softly, as if saying it too loud might make what happened more real. Her co-workers at the insurance office described her as dependable, always early, never distracted. When detectives came to question them, their answers were short, careful. No one knew anything unusual. No arguments, no strange calls, no reason for her to vanish. At the small white church she attended every Sunday, her seat remained empty. The pastor spoke briefly about faith and fear, but avoided naming her directly. After the service, neighbors stood outside in silence, avoiding eye contact, unsure of what to say. The unease was heavy, almost physical. Detectives continued to make rounds through town, revisiting anyone who might have known her routines. They questioned the mail carrier, the grocery clerk, even the man who repaired her fence last spring. Everyone wanted to help, but no one had answers. The case file thickened, but the evidence did not. Mary Ellen's sister, Laura, appeared on the local evening news. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes told a different story. She pleaded for information, for anyone who had seen something, anything. The reporter asked about hope, but Laura's response was simple. She only wanted to bring her sister home. The sheriff's department organized a second community search, smaller than the first. Fewer volunteers showed up this time. Some said it was too painful. Others admitted they were scared. Parents began locking their doors earlier. Teenagers who once walked home after dark now waited for rides. At the diner near Main Street, whispers replaced laughter. Customers watched strangers with suspicion. Every unfamiliar car drew attention. The waitress said the town had not felt this tense in years. Even routine noises, a slamming door, a barking dog, made people look twice. Flyers with Mary Ellen's photo stayed taped to telephone poles, edges curling under rain and wind. Days turned to weeks, and the search updates became shorter. Reporters stopped visiting. New stories took over the headlines. But in this town, her absence remained. Detective Whitmore still checked in weekly, though there was little to report. The case file sat open, pages worn from being turned too often, weeks turned into months. The first lead came from 2 counties away. A truck driver walked into a rest-stop diner and told a waitress he had done something terrible. When local deputies brought him in, he claimed he had picked up a woman matching Mary Ellen's description near the highway the night she disappeared. He spoke of guilt, of running from his past, but his story fell apart within hours. The timeline did not match, and his logbook placed him hundreds of miles away that night. The confession was false. Another man seeking attention. Days later, a call came from across the state line. A woman's body had been found near a wooded trail in Tennessee. The age, hair color, and height were close. Detective Whitmore drove there himself, refusing to rely on second-hand reports. The morgue was silent except for the hum of overhead lights. When the sheet was pulled back, he knew instantly it was not Mary Ellen. Another family's tragedy, another dead end. Back in Kentucky, the team continued to comb through phone records, bank statements, and surveillance footage, from nearby gas stations. Each frame was studied, each call traced, but nothing pointed to where Mary Ellen had gone. Witnesses contradicted each other. One claimed to have seen her car near the river. Another insisted she was at a diner miles away. None of it held up under scrutiny. Then came the letters. 3 of them, typed on cheap paper, mailed anonymously to the sheriff's office. The writer claimed to know the truth about what happened. The words were vague, filled with cryptic details that seemed convincing at first. Forensic teams dusted for prints, checked the postmarks, and ran linguistic analysis. The results came back clean. No fingerprints, no DNA, no match in any database. The letters stopped as suddenly as they began. The pressure inside the department grew. Reporters called daily, asking for updates that did not exist. The sheriff faced questions about funding, manpower, and why a young woman could vanish without a trace in their town. Behind closed doors, morale was slipping. The search had become a cycle of hope and disappointment. Detective Whitmore refused to close the case. Most nights he stayed long after everyone had gone home. The sound of the air conditioner filled the silence as he reviewed the same photographs, the same reports. His desk was cluttered with coffee cups, old notebooks, and a map marked with red pins. Every tip, every sighting, every false promise. He revisited every piece of evidence from the abandoned car, the coffee cup, the purse, the keys. Nothing had been missed, yet something still felt wrong. He wrote new notes in the margins, small thoughts that never made it into the official file. The weight of the unanswered questions followed him home. Months had passed, and the caseboard had become part of the office wall, another reminder of failure. The photos had begun to yellow at the edges. The handwriting on the labels was fading. In the center of it all was Mary Ellen's picture, a quiet smile, eyes fixed on something distant. Beneath it, a single note in Whitmore's handwriting read, "Still missing." The lights flickered once before shutting off for the night, leaving the board glowing faintly in the darkness. Her face still watching, waiting for an answer. The case file was placed in a metal drawer labeled Missing Persons, 1974. From that moment, silence began to settle over it. The maps, photographs, and handwritten notes that once filled Detective Whitmore's desk were boxed, sealed, and stored on a back shelf inside the county records room. Months turned into years. Each season passed without progress. The search efforts stopped quietly, without announcement or ceremony. Patrols no longer drove down Route 17. The posters peeled from telephone poles. Mary Ellen Parker's name slipped from daily conversation, replaced by newer tragedies. Her family tried to hold on. Her sister, Alice, wrote letters to the sheriff's office every few months, polite, steady, and desperate. Each one asked the same question in different words. Has anything changed? Most replies were short acknowledgements, typed by clerks who had never worked the case. Still, the letters never stopped. By the early 1980s, Detective Harold Whitmore had retired. He left behind a clean desk and one final note in his case report. No closure. Further review recommended. His replacement barely knew the name. New crimes took priority, and the old files gathered dust. Evidence once seen as vital now sat in fading boxes. The coffee cup, the purse, the torn piece of fabric from the woods. Labels yellowed, ink bled. Time erased sharp edges. The Parker family eventually left Kentucky. Their small house was sold, and neighbors recalled only that the youngest sister moved north, taking the last photograph of Mary Ellen with her. Birthdays passed unmarked. Newspapers stopped mentioning her name, and the few reporters who once followed the case shifted to other beats. Through the 1980s and 1990s, progress in forensic science changed how missing person cases were handled. New databases, DNA testing, and digital archiving. But Mary Ellen's case remained on paper, untouched by modern systems. No DNA samples had ever been preserved. The car once held as evidence was returned to her family and eventually scrapped. Every trace of physical proof was lost to time. Inside the county records room, the air smelled of paper and rust. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, arranged by year. Somewhere among them, under a layer of dust, sat case file 74-216. The photographs inside showed a smiling young woman, unaware that her image would one day symbolize an unsolved disappearance. The silence surrounding her story became complete. No new witnesses came forward. No one reported suspicious behavior. The highway where her car was found became busier, paved wider, and lined with new gas stations. To travelers passing through, it was just another stretch of road. Nearly 2 decades after she vanished, the Parker case existed only in old reports and fading memories. Detectives who once searched for her were gone, their replacements unaware of her name. The investigation had become a ghost, a reminder of work unfinished, justice unserved. But in the late 1990s, as the department began digitizing old files, a young detective noticed the box. It was heavier than the others. On the front, a single word had been underlined twice in red ink: unresolved. He carried it to his desk, unaware that opening it would bring the past back to life and uncover secrets long buried beneath 20 years of silence. The file had not been opened in almost 20 years when it appeared on the desk of Detective Claire Morrison, part of Kentucky's cold case unit. It was routine work, another set of aging files to be reviewed, scanned and logged as part of the state's DNA backlog project. Nothing about the brown, faded folder stood out. The label simply read, Parker, Mary Ellen, missing 1974. Inside were brittle papers, a few black and white photographs, and 2 small sealed evidence envelopes. One contained a strand of hair recovered from the passenger seat of Mary Ellen's green Plymouth Duster. The other held a cigarette butt found near the car door. Both items had been collected almost half a century earlier, long before forensic DNA profiling existed. Detective Morrison logged them for re-examination, unaware of what they would reveal. The envelopes were carefully transported to the State Crime Lab in Frankfurt, where analysts began the slow process of extracting genetic material. Technicians handled the items with surgical precision. The hair sample was first. Under modern microscopes, even its faded color still carried microscopic cells at the root. After multiple cleaning cycles, a partial DNA profile began to form. It was weak but not lost. The cigarette butt followed. Its fibers protected a trace amount of saliva. That profile, stronger and clearer, became the key. For weeks, the samples underwent amplification, sequencing, and digital comparison. Computers cross-referenced thousands of entries in the combined DNA index system, CODIS. Matches were rare. Most cold case samples from the 1970s degraded beyond recovery. But on a quiet Tuesday morning in April 2021, the screen flashed a hit. The system had found a 99.8% match to a profile in the federal database, a man named Frank Dillard, 74 years old, living in rural Georgia. His DNA had entered the database years earlier, after a minor assault arrest, long forgotten by the courts. The lab analyst double-checked the result, then called Detective Morrison. The words were calm, but the impact was immediate. We have a match. Frank Dillard had never been mentioned in the original investigation. His name did not appear in any report or interview from 1974. When Morrison reviewed the old notes, she saw no connection between him and Mary Ellen Parker. That made the result even more striking and more suspicious. Within hours, the cold case unit convened. The cigarette butt, collected near the open driver's door, had been handled and sealed properly, meaning contamination was almost impossible. The match was real. Forensic experts confirmed that the probability of a random hit was less than 1 in 1 billion. Detective Morrison began tracing Dillard's history. Records showed he had worked as a traveling mechanic in the 1970s, often moving from one rural job to another, across Kentucky and Tennessee. Old employment logs placed him in Grant County, only 20 miles from where Mary Ellen disappeared. The timeline aligned too neatly to ignore. Investigators contacted Georgia authorities for quiet background surveillance. Dillard, now a widower, lived alone on the outskirts of Augusta. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, a man who rarely spoke about his past. He still drove an old blue pickup truck, the same color witnesses had described near Mary Ellen's car decades earlier. Detective Morrison requested confirmation through genealogical DNA comparison, a new technique that could verify identity by linking distant relatives. Within weeks, the match strengthened again. The evidence was irrefutable. In late June 2021, Morrison prepared a formal summary for the Attorney General's office. It read, Suspect identified through DNA match connected to evidence from 1974 disappearance of Mary Ellen Parker. Recommend immediate field investigation and interview. The cold case that had once slipped into silence was alive again. As news traveled through internal channels, retired officers who had once worked the Parker case received calls. Some could barely believe it. Others admitted they had always expected an answer, even after all these years. The next step was delicate. Investigators could not afford to alert Dillard before verifying every piece of supporting evidence. They reviewed old photographs of the crime scene, reconstructed the approximate area where the cigarette butt had been found, and confirmed that the evidence custody chain was intact from 1974 to 2021. It was flawless. By mid-July, the Kentucky Cold Case Unit prepared to travel to Georgia with arrest coordination support. Their plan was simple: confirm identity, confront Dillard, and bring him in for questioning. The trip was scheduled for a Monday morning. Morrison packed the file carefully into her briefcase, the same file that had once gathered dust for decades. When she closed it, she looked again at the photograph of Mary Ellen Parker, clipped to the front page. The woman whose smile had once vanished without trace now had a voice again, carried through strands of hair and a forgotten cigarette. That evidence had waited 47 years to speak, and the man it pointed, to Frank Dillard, had no idea that investigators were already on their way. The photograph of Mary Ellen stared back from the cold case, bored, frozen in 1974, her smile untouched by time. Detective Lauren Mitchell stood in front of it, arms crossed, the hum of the fluorescent light echoing through the small office of Kentucky's Cold Case Unit. The DNA hit from Georgia had given the case new life, but for Lauren, it was more than a file. It was a story that had been left unfinished for nearly 50 years. She began where every case begins, the beginning. The night of Mary Ellen's disappearance. The original reports were thin: a shift at the textile factory, a late drive home, a car found abandoned near the old river road. Lauren spread the documents across the table, handwritten notes, faded Polaroids, and brittle typewritten pages. Each line carried the weight of a time when investigation meant instinct more than science. Mary Ellen's car had been processed in 1974, but the methods were crude. Now every piece of evidence had been retested, every object catalogued in digital records. The strand of hair and the cigarette butt had linked to Frank Dillard, a retired mechanic. But Lauren knew DNA alone was not enough. She needed a story that proved opportunity, onus, and motive. She built a timeline: factory clockouts, employee rosters, shift rotations. Somewhere in those numbers was the bridge between Mary Ellen and Dillard. Through archived employment records, she found his name: F. Dillard, maintenance contractor. He had worked at a machine repair shop 2 blocks from Mary Ellen's factory. The proximity was too close to ignore. Lauren traced Dillard's route. Old highway maps showed a direct road from his shop to the area where Mary Ellen's car was found, the same stretch of gravel where her shoes had been discovered weeks later. She stared at the map, tracing the line with a pencil. It was more than coincidence. It was movement. Next came the interviews. Lauren listened to hours of taped conversations recorded in the 1970s. Witnesses long gone, their voices preserved in static. One factory worker had mentioned a quiet mechanic who sometimes offered rides when night shifts ended. Another recalled a blue pickup parked behind the mill, same make and color Dillard once owned. Small details, but they stacked like bricks. Lauren ordered background checks, cross-referenced vehicle registrations, and reconstructed the hours leading up to Mary Ellen's disappearance. Piece by piece, the past began to form shape again. A man who lingered too long after work. A route that matched. A timeline that finally made sense. But obsession brings its own silence. Lauren worked late into the night, coffee cooling beside her as she replayed each file. The deeper she went, the clearer the picture became. Dillard had moved to Georgia in 1976, just 2 years after the crime. Married twice. No criminal record. A quiet man in a quiet neighborhood. It was the kind of life people build when they are running from something. She opened the final folder, the forensic reconstruction of the scene. Soil samples, fiber traces, tire impressions. Technology in 2021 could see what the detectives in 1974 never could. Partial tire patterns matched the model of Dillard's pickup. Microscopic fibers from the truck's seat were consistent with threads from Mary Ellen's work uniform. It was enough for probable cause. Lauren typed the request for a warrant, the sound of the keys sharp in the stillness of the office. She reviewed the evidence once more. DNA, vehicle, location, timeline, each element connected through decades of silence. The picture was no longer blurred. She paused before signing, eyes fixed on Mary Ellen's photograph one last time. The case that had haunted generations was finally breathing again. As she sent the file to the district attorney's office, the clock struck midnight. Within hours, Georgia authorities would receive the alert, and for the first time in nearly 50 years, Frank Dillard's name would be spoken by police again. The hunt was about to begin. The door clicked shut behind him as Frank Dillard entered the interview room. At 74, his movements were slow but deliberate, his face calm and unreadable. The walls were bare, the lights bright, and the air thick with quiet expectation. Across the table, detectives from Kentucky's cold case unit prepared the evidence file that had crossed 5 decades to reach this moment. It began with formality, fingerprints, photographs, and paperwork. But beneath the surface, everyone in that room knew what this was. The final step in a story that had refused to stay buried. The man who had escaped time was now face to face with it. Investigators started with the facts. The DNA from the cigarette butt found in Mary Ellen's car. The hair strand recovered from the seat fabric. The tire impressions linked to a 1970s blue pickup, registered under his name. Each piece presented not as theory but as truth, backed by science, confirmed by time. Dillard said nothing at first. His eyes stayed low, fixed on the table, hands folded neatly as if he were attending a quiet meeting. But the stillness told its own story. Decades of silence breaking in slow motion. The detectives continued, layering the evidence one item at a time. Employment records showed his maintenance work near Mary Ellen's factory. Witness statements placed his truck at the site. Travel logs tied him to the area on the night she vanished. Every angle closed in with precision. As the hours passed, his composure began to crack. A slow exhale. Ua glanced toward the corner camera, the kind of small movements that mark the moment truth starts to rise. The investigators watched without interruption. Finally, when confronted with the DNA report, a 1 in a billion match, Dillard nodded once. Their quiet acknowledgement that the science had done what time could not. He began to speak slowly, voice hoarse, tone detached. The details were simple, almost emotionless. He had offered Mary Ellen a ride after her shift. She was tired. It was late. Then, as he said, things went wrong. He gave no dramatic confession, no apology, no clear explanation. Just fragments, a route taken, a moment of anger, a decision that turned violent. His words were stripped of emotion, as if describing someone else's actions. But the meaning was unmistakable. Detectives documented each sentence carefully. The recording captured every pause, every tremor in his voice. His memories of that night were faded, but the evidence had filled the blanks he tried to leave empty. When asked about the location of her remains, he hesitated. Then, slowly, he marked a spot on the map, near the old river road where her car had been found. Forensic teams were already preparing to search the site. But in that room, the case had reached its breaking point. After nearly 50 years, Mary Ellen's story had found its voice, through the man who had taken it from her. The paperwork followed. Dillard's hand trembled slightly as he held the pen. The confession form waited in front of him, plain and final. He read each line carefully, as if searching for a way out that no longer existed. Then, without a word, he signed his name. The ink bled slowly into the paper. The detectives sat in silence, the weight of history pressing down. They had no reason to celebrate, only to finish what others had started long before them. When Dillard was escorted out of the room, he looked straight ahead. No expression, no resistance, just a quiet surrender to what had finally caught up with him. Outside, the rain had started to fall, like soft, steady, and unending. Inside the evidence room, the case file of Mary Ellen Harper was marked, closed, confession obtained. But for Detective Lauren Mitchell, the story was not finished yet, because what Dillard said about that night did not explain everything. The final truth was still waiting to be found. The news broke quietly on a Thursday morning. A single line in a state press release announced the arrest of 74-year-old Frank Dillard for for the 1974 murder of Mary Ellen Harper. By noon, every local radio station in Kentucky was repeating the name that had once haunted an entire generation. For many, it felt unreal. The case had been buried beneath decades of silence, a story whispered in diners, retold by teachers, remembered by few who were still alive to care. Yet suddenly it was back. Officers from the Kentucky State Police escorted Dillard out of his small Georgia home. Cameras waited near the front gate. He appeared calm, dressed neatly, offering no words as he was led into an unmarked vehicle. The image traveled fast. An old man in handcuffs accused of ending a young woman's life nearly half a century ago. In the town where Mary Ellen had once lived, the reaction was muted but heavy. Local newspapers reopened their archives, printing old headlines beside new ones. The Harper case was no longer a forgotten tragedy. It was front-page news again. Reporters interviewed former neighbors who remembered the night she vanished. Some spoke of curfews, search parties, and fear that gripped the streets back then. Others admitted they had assumed the case would never be solved. One man described seeing Dillard's face on the screen and feeling his stomach drop, realizing he had once bought tools from him at a garage outside town. Mary Ellen's sister, Margaret, now in her 70s, agreed to speak briefly to the press. Her voice was steady but faint. She said she had written letters to the police every year, asking them not to close the case. "I just wanted someone to remember her," she said. There were no tears, no dramatic statements, only quiet relief that her sister's name would no longer rest among the unsolved. In the courthouse, the hearing drew a small crowd. A handful of locals filled the benches, joined by retired detectives who had once carried the case file themselves. Dillard sat motionless beside his attorney, head slightly bowed, eyes fixed forward. The prosecutors read the evidence, DNA results, employment records, the confession. The room stayed silent except for the sound of pages turning and the judge's voice echoing off the walls. When the verdict came, there was no outburst, no applause. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole. Dillard showed no reaction. He was led away as quietly as he had entered, his footsteps fading into the hallway. Outside, cameras waited again, but there were no dramatic statements this time either. Just brief comments from officials, thanking forensic teams and the cold case unit. One retired investigator said softly, "We waited half a lifetime for this. In town, people left flowers near the old factory site where Mary Ellen had once worked. Most had never met her, but they felt the weight of what had been lost and finally found. For a few days, the story filled the air again, on television, in classrooms, in church halls. Then slowly, life returned to its quiet rhythm. In the records office of the Kentucky State Police, the file of Mary Ellen Harper was moved from cold case to closed homicides. A thin red line marked the transfer. Detective Lauren Mitchell reviewed the final paperwork late that night. On her desk sat the same photograph that had once faded on Detective Whitmore's wall. Mary Ellen smiling, eyes bright, frozen in 1974. Mitchell placed the photo back into the folder and closed it gently. But even with the case closed, one question remained. Why had Dillard kept her secret for so long? The answer, she knew, was buried deeper than any evidence could ever reach. The file was closed, the sentence delivered, and the headlines faded as quickly as they had come. What remained was silence, the kind that settles after half a century of waiting. For the Kentucky Cold Case Unit, it was one more victory recorded in the long struggle against forgotten crimes. For Detective Lauren Mitchell, it was something deeper. The quiet realization that justice, even delayed, still mattered. She had never met Mary Ellen Harper, never heard her voice or seen the small details that once made her real. Yet for 2 years, Mary Ellen's name had lived on every report, every late-night review, every unanswered question. Now the answers were written in ink. DNA, statements, and a signature on a confession form, evidence that had slept for decades, had finally spoken. The town where it began had changed beyond recognition. The factory where Mary Ellen worked was gone, replaced by an empty lot and a cracked parking line where grass pushed through. The diner that once buzzed with talk of her disappearance had long closed its doors. Yet in the middle of all that quietness, her story had returned, not as a ghost but as a record of persistence. Detective Mitchell drove down the same narrow road where Mary Ellen's car was last seen. The cornfields stood high, golden under the late summer sun. Somewhere along those rows, a young woman had vanished in 1974. For decades, her name had lived only in reports, photographs, and memory. Now it rested among solved cases, but the stillness of the place carried its own weight. At the town cemetery, a modest headstone bore the inscription, Mary Ellen Harper, 1953-1974. There were no crowds, no speeches, and no cameras. Just one detective, a folder under her arm and a folded piece of paper in her hand. She placed it carefully at the base of the stone. It read, Case Closed, 2021. Mitchell stood for a moment, not out of ceremony but respect. The air was quiet. Somewhere a wind chime moved from a nearby porch, breaking the silence for a few seconds before fading again. Back at headquarters, the Harper case file joined a shelf of others marked Closed. The photo that once hung on the wall, the one Detective Harold Whitmore had pinned there in the 1970s, had been restored and refiled. The corners were worn, the color faded, but the image remained clear enough to remember. There were no celebrations, no grand statements. Justice in cold cases rarely arrived with triumph. It arrived with exhaustion, relief, and silence. But it arrived nonetheless. For the Harper family, there was no undoing the years lost. For the department, there was no changing the time it took. But for the record, truth had finally caught up. The cornfield that once hid secrets now stood empty and peaceful again. The road nearby carried cars that no longer slowed to stare, no longer wondered what had happened there. And for the first time since that autumn evening in 1974, Mary Ellen Harper's story had an ending. The coffee cup found warm in 1974 finally went cold.